SMBs can be very interesting for the board's implementation.
About 50% of the global gross national product is generated by small and medium-sized businesses. Ukraine is no exception.
From an investment perspective, it is likely the SMBs that can generate the greatest added value.
The investor acts as a guarantor, ensuring that their investment will drive the company's growth and development.
Personally, I am a fan of SMBs. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Boards of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Our guest today is Oksana Strashna. Oksana, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Oksana is currently the director of the Direct Investment Program in SMEs, that is small and medium-sized businesses, at the Ukraine-Moldova American Enterprise Fund. In addition, Oksana has extensive experience working in the investment business. Oksana started her career at Western NS Fund and then at Horizon Capital. At Horizon Capital, Oksana was a partner and was directly involved in private equity investments from start to finish, starting with identifying investment targets and continuing through the value creation process. This included due diligence, deal structuring, and organizing the exit strategy. Oksana has extensive experience working on boards and in corporate governance overall. Oksana has been and continues to be a member of Supervisory and Advisory Boards of companies of various formats. These include private companies as well as NGOs or public associations. In addition, Oksana was a member of the Board of Directors of the Corporate Governance Professional Association.
Yes.
Oksana and I will focus our discussion on small and medium-sized enterprises, their investment attractiveness, and corporate governance, specifically within these types of companies.
Yes, Sergey, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and I will be happy to answer the questions and share my experience.
Oksana, you are currently working as the director of the Direct Investment Program for small and medium-sized businesses at the Ukraine-Moldova American Enterprise Fund. What challenges do you see regarding the development of SMEs in Ukraine?
First of all, if we look at the top challenges that small and medium-sized businesses are trying to solve for themselves, there are two main groups. The first is everything related to development and the implementation of a successful growth strategy. And the second group of issues is personnel, how to attract qualified staff, how to retain them, and how to organize succession. And in our situation, the same challenges exist, but they are complicated by the fact that small and medium-sized businesses have been operating for 3 years under conditions of quite high risks and uncertainty due to the full-scale war. In other words, the challenges are the same, but the context in which small and medium-sized businesses operate is far more complex.
SMBs offer significant potential for additional value creation in investments, especially through a private equity approach. On the other hand, there are quite a lot of issues related to strategy and systematization, as well as the fact that owners often take on the role of CEO in managing the company. How far can corporate governance go in providing support here?
As I said, there are essentially groups of challenges, and the main ones can be split into these two groups. Corporate governance can be the tool that provides the owner with answers on how to develop, in what way, and how to reduce the risks associated with the company's growth. It is important to understand that when we talk about small and medium-sized businesses, we are dealing with quite a broad concept, meaning the range of small and medium-sized businesses is quite broad. A small business is one with an annual turnover of up to $10 million, as is commonly accepted in Europe and here as well. And a medium-sized business is one with a turnover of up to $50 million. In other words, what matters and what works for a $5 million business will be different. What matters will be effective for businesses with revenues of $40 to $50 million. And while corporate governance is a tool that can support owners at every stage of a company's development, it is crucial to understand that it needs to be right-sized, that is, calibrated to the scale of the business. To recall the definition, what is corporate governance? Corporate governance is a system of practices, processes, and rules by which a business is managed and directed. It is a system that defines how decisions are made and how responsibilities are distributed among owners, management, and supervisory bodies. How transparency is ensured, how accountability is maintained, and how strategic development is supported. And these rules, procedures, and corporate governance systems are like the structure of a house, like the foundation of a building, and depending on the size of the house, whether it's a small one-story building or a skyscraper, these frameworks need to be calibrated to the size of the business. That's why the implementation of corporate governance should take place gradually. Yes, it should be done gradually. It is crucial not to override never burden a small company, but rather to regulate it appropriately. But it is equally important that as the business grows, corporate governance keeps pace. The governance structure must always align with the company's objectives and growth, continuously evolving in step with the business. And I think this is the kind of challenge for small and medium-sized businesses to understand when it's time to change so that it isn't too late. And instead of merely closing off risks, it's about ensuring the company does not fall into a risk zone because systems and procedures have not kept up with its growth.
According to IFC research, if I recall correctly, in 2020-2021, small and medium-sized businesses in Ukraine generated over 50% of the country's GDP. What's very interesting is that in this statistic, Ukraine was positioned between China and America, meaning China had a little higher score than Ukraine. America's percentage was a bit lower than Ukraine's. On the one hand, this means that, in fact, small and medium-sized businesses really can generate a significant share of GDP. On the other hand, they can be very interesting for investment and for creating added value because any SMB can be further developed. Plus, they are probably also very interesting for the introduction of boards because the percentage of companies that have either supervisory boards or at least advisory boards is very small. So this represents a significant white space opportunity both for corporate governance and for investment.
Yes, Sergiy, indeed, small and medium-sized businesses are the engine of the economy in any country. Globally, they generate around 50% of the world's gross domestic product, and Ukraine is no exception. In Ukraine, small and medium-sized businesses have demonstrated their ability to survive and adapt. And although many businesses closed in the first months following the start of the full-scale war, by the end of 2022, most small businesses and enterprises had largely resumed their operations. And in 2023, 40% of employed people were working at small and medium-sized enterprises. So indeed, this is a sector that not only generates GDP, but also lays the foundation of the economy. It is also a sector that eases social tension because it provides employment for people. There was a rather interesting study by McKinsey on the economic impact of small and medium-sized businesses. It wasn't a global study. They selected a number of developing countries as well as several developed ones. According to this study, if small and medium-sized businesses were to raise their productivity to the level seen in large enterprises, it could add 10% to the gross domestic product in developing countries and an additional 5% in developed countries. So small and medium-sized businesses really do make a very significant contribution to the economy. When does this leap, which could raise the productivity of small and medium-sized businesses to the level of large enterprises, occur? There are many factors involved, including improved management, better planning, the ability to attract top talent, and integration into the global economy. Because that's when small businesses gain, first and foremost, access to new markets. Yes, they may have a unique niche product and have already reached the ceiling in their local market, but also integration into the global economy. It doesn't matter whether a Ukrainian small or medium-sized business becomes a supplier or sells its own products. In any case, this integration also means learning new things, improving technology, and enhancing business practices. So this integration will still have a positive impact on the company's development. Therefore, improving corporate governance for small and medium-sized businesses will reduce risks and help the company reach its full potential. The only thing I would still distinguish is between the board and corporate governance. Corporate governance encompasses the entire system, while establishing a board represents the highest stage. A company has to go a certain way towards corporate governance, meaning you need to start with the foundation and work your way up to establishing a board.
From an investment perspective, SMBs probably have the potential to generate the greatest added value. Why? Because there is a lot of untapped potential, plenty that can be improved through the introduction of expertise, proper management, and strategic input. On the other hand, SMBs are probably the most challenging investment target because there is often a lack of systematization. At the entry point, many aspects may be non-transparent for an investor, and this will need to be addressed either by the investor directly or through the establishment of proper corporate governance.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Small and medium-sized businesses are quite a complex segment for investment precisely because they are so dynamic. Well, companies that are seeking investment usually do so because they are growing very rapidly. These factors are interconnected As a company continues to grow, owners naturally focus on growth and may not always have time to build up corporate governance systems. For an investor, this represents both a risk and an opportunity. When evaluating small or medium-sized businesses, an investor assesses the level of corporate governance in the company. What does this mean? An investor looks at how decisions are made. Are they based on analysis, numbers, and data? Or are they more emotional, driven by the owner's personal vision? How competent and qualified are the professionals in the business? Is there a management team in place? And how well is it structured? Are there any gaps that need to be filled or reinforced? Are there any questionable business practices within the company? Does the company have an internal control system and measures to prevent fraud? Is there a system or rules that govern, for example, transactions with related parties? Has the company already reached a level of transparency in its dealings with third parties, such as having an auditor, or is this something they still need to achieve? Because all of these are components of a corporate governance system. An investor evaluates the state of corporate governance and suggests steps to improve it, making the company more transparent and understandable, not only for the investor, but also for other stakeholders for whom transparency is important. Again, in SMBs, it is important that any changes suggested by an investor are feasible, things the company can realistically implement and work with. In other words, the investor should propose changes that improve decision-making, enhance the company's manageability, and protect the investor's interests. Sometimes these changes are implemented before the investor comes on board. Sometimes there is an agreement to implement these changes over a certain period. However, this needs to be done to reduce the risk that the company will raise capital but fail to use it effectively, maximizing benefits both for the company and the investor. There is a bit more work involved here than when entering a mature business, where everything is already established and the systems are functioning, and perhaps only specific areas need improvement.
On the other hand, this represents an additional risk, additional work, and likely extra added value created by the investment.
In other words, it's additional risk and additional effort. For example, improving the professional level of managers working in the company. When hiring for a large company, you have a bigger pool of candidates because the company is large, financially stable, and may already have a well-known brand. It's a bit easier for such companies to attract highly qualified specialists. For small and medium-sized businesses, they operate within their own constraints. They have limited financial resources and may not yet have a brand that would attract someone with future growth in mind. So for a manager who has previously led larger companies to join a smaller company, they need to believe that it has strong growth potential. And this is precisely one of the ways an investor can create added value when coming on board. He becomes a sort of guarantor by coming in and investing. The investor signals that the company will develop and that everyone involved now has a promising future ahead.
Personally, I'm a fan of SMBs, particularly in establishing boards or consulting them. Why? Because I can see how quickly implemented decisions produce tangible results, and it's very easy to track these outcomes. And it's an additional opportunity to understand your own contribution to the development of this business. Although from time to time there are quite complicated cases, for example, when the business owner has structured the company legally in such a way that it's very difficult to prove ownership. When analyzing the legal structure, it's clear that before approaching an investor, a lot of preparatory work must be done, including normalizing the legal structure so that the ultimate beneficiary is clearly identifiable. Regarding management, there are cases where the owner believes there is a CEO in place, but in reality, owner has delegated responsibility to CEO without granting them proper authority. As a result, the owner effectively manages the company in the role of CEO while someone else is formally accountable. So, there really is a lot of work, but it can be corrected quite quickly. Of course, before approaching a serious investor, thorough preparatory work is essential. Oksana, how willing are you to be involved in this pre-investment phase, that is, preparing an SMB so that it can be considered by potential investors like yourself?
When we engage with companies, even before any formal structural due diligence process, we try to assess the level of corporate governance, the organizational structure, the areas of responsibility for different managers, their backgrounds, and the experience of the specialists involved. We form an impression of where improvements could be made and can share this perspective with the company. If we are not yet in the due diligence phase, that is, if we are not fully committed to making an investment, these recommendations remain just advice. We can share our perspective, but it's up to the company whether they want to implement any changes or not. I would hope that if the company and its owners are serious about making an investment, receiving such feedback would prompt them to consider how to implement improvements and perhaps engage a consultant to help them do so. For example, I understand this is what you do. Once we enter the due diligence process and see that the company has a strong chance of becoming part of our portfolio, we can provide more detailed recommendations and not just provide them but share the results of our due diligence report. Then we decide how these changes will be implemented. We have a small team, so wherever possible, we help the company do it themselves. At the same time, we rely on the possibility of the company working with a consultant if needed. Yes, we can involve consultants in this process.
I'd like to revisit the list of recommendations that even a potential investor provides during due diligence. And this is probably an invaluable resource for an SMB, as it allows the company to receive guidance without the need to hire expensive consultants. What's more important is that these recommendations come from an active investor. They are practical, valuable, and most importantly, should be highly appreciated by the SMBs receiving them.
Indeed, for every company, when they are looking for an investor, it is often their first time and very frequently the only time they will go through this process of seeking and attracting investment. The exception is the tech sector, where funding rounds happen regularly. But in SMBs, especially in the real sector, this process typically occurs just once. At the same time, for the investor, this is their job. An investor is constantly meeting with companies making investments and selling. When selling, they meet with strategic investors, especially if it's a sale to this type of buyers, and receive feedback on how those buyers evaluate the acquisition. This feedback becomes valuable information for the future. From the investor's perspective, they have a wealth of information they can share with the company they are meeting with. However, the relevance of these pieces of advice depends largely on how transparent the company has been with the investor, what they've shared about their current situation, and how open they've been at this stage of the process. So any advice that an investor gives is always contextual, but the advice is given, and this phase of communication with the company is indeed very valuable. After that, it depends on the owner. It might just be of interest to them, or they might see actionable points they can begin implementing to improve their chances of further communication and securing investments. It could also simply be about improving their business overall.
Some time ago, I heard a statement from one investor that if a company has a board, supervisory board, or even an advisory board, theoretically, it could result in a higher valuation, essentially a multiplier effect in the investor's assessment. Recently, I had a conversation with bankers and asked a similar question regarding the attractiveness of a business that has a board of directors or a supervisory board. Specifically, I wanted to understand how much more appealing such a structure is from a bank's perspective, or how much a bank values having a business with a board. And the bankers responded that it's not a decisive factor because their system simply doesn't have a checkbox for it. However, it does create an added level of comfort for the lender. But how is this viewed by investors? How important is it for an investor that the company already has a functioning board in some form?
I really liked what you said, Sergey, about the checkbox, because for an investor, there isn't a scoring system where you tick a box saying the company has a board and suddenly $500,000 is added to the valuation. That kind of checkbox doesn't exist. And again, as you rightly pointed out earlier, the presence of a board, whether it's an advisory board, supervisory board, or a board of directors, doesn't necessarily mean that a corporate governance system is actually in place. Because if owners value expertise and has gathered people around them whom they call a board and even consults with them, that still doesn't mean the advice they receive can actually be implemented within the company for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's just casual conversations and the advice is based on fragments of information, but to provide meaningful, actionable advice, you really need access to proper information about the company. You need reports, numbers, and an understanding of the broader context. You need to know how competitors behave too, and that's only possible when there is a system in place that generates this information. The information must be reliable and shared regularly with the people responsible for making making decisions. In some companies, aside from the owner who decides what to do or not to do, there might not even be a management team capable of implementing those decisions. So having a board, if there's a board, but underneath it there's chaos, well, it might simply be enjoyable for the owner to talk and exchange ideas with smart people. But if a company has a proper decision-making system in place, a system for collecting and analyzing information, and if there are experienced professionals with clearly defined areas of responsibility, people who are empowered by the owner to make decisions, who keep the owner informed in a timely manner, and who contribute to shaping the development strategy that the owner then brings to the board level for discussion and approval, then that's a completely different situation. In this case, even though there still may not be a direct, formal link to valuation, the presence of such processes, imperfect as they may be, means that decisions are being made based on data and analysis by qualified people, supported by a board that provides feedback and guidance, helping to resolve complex issues based on their experience. And this will inevitably be reflected in the company's operational and financial performance. Such a company will stand out from its competitors and will show stronger metrics. And that is what ultimately influences valuation.
It's a very interesting topic. And in my work with SMB format companies, I've come to the conclusion that advisory boards in their standard form generally don't function effectively in the SMB space. This is largely due to a lack of systematization and weak management discipline. Even if a decision is made, there's no guarantee it will be implemented correctly. So in a pure sense, I believe advisory boards are unlikely to bring tangible value to the business, apart from perhaps satisfying the owner's personal interest in engaging with experienced individuals. Oksana, given your experience both as an investor and as a corporate governance expert, what advice would you offer SMB owners to help them grow and develop their businesses?
For developing corporate governance, right?
In terms of business development, corporate governance can be valuable both for attracting potential investors and for systematizing the business as it currently exists, as well as for guiding future growth strategy.
My advice is to gradually implement corporate governance principles. As the business grows, I always emphasize gradual progress, moving away from practices where decisions are based solely on the owner's intuition. That said, it is still very important for the owner to have a clear vision. In SMBs, the owner's vision and drive are closely intertwined with the business itself. The owner's personal passion for developing the business is extremely important. However, as the business grows, the cost of mistakes increases. What could once be an experiment costing $100,000 might, at a $3 million scale, have a very different impact on the company's financial position. Therefore, it's essential for owners to establish a corporate governance structure, build a proper decision-making system, and clearly define areas of responsibility. At an early stage, each specialist wears many hats, handling multiple areas of responsibility. Over time, the owner looks for specialists with narrower but deeper areas of expertise. All these steps need to be followed: implementing internal control systems, fraud prevention measures, and ensuring business transparency, both internally within the company and externally with third parties. This is extremely important. For example, regarding how to approach supervisory boards. Establishing a board is not a panacea. A company needs to reach the right stage for a board to have meaningful impact. The business and its owner need to assess whether it's the right time to establish a supervisory body, whether they have the financial and managerial resources to work with it, and whether decisions will actually be implemented. If the creation of this supervisory strategic body is approached gradually, I often hear from SMBs asking, "When you come in, will you help us set up a board at the first meeting?" I explain that we can assist, but we first need to see if it's actually necessary. Perhaps initially we establish a sort of management board plus. We assess the company's existing structure and determine that the first collective decision-making board could be this provisional management board plus, where top managers and owners, most of whom are also CEOs, meet regularly. Reports and analytics are prepared for these meetings, and the Management Board Plus reviews the company's performance. They discuss plans for the future, essentially practicing the work of a board. If this works well, management then can focus on operations, while a proper supervisory board is created to handle the broader picture and strategic issues. I believe that in SMBs, the owner's role is very important. I think the owner should should be part of the board. In other words, you can't have a board working with management while the shareholders or owners, maybe just one or two people, are separate and detached from these discussions. I believe it's very important for owners to be members of the board. This allows them, like other board members, to access the information needed for decision making. They meet in one place, see the information, some of which the owner may already have more of, but there is also information that is shared with all board members, which they discuss and use to make decisions. The board's recommendations can then be adopted by the owners, or not as I see it. The owners should retain majority voting rights. They make the decisions, it's their business. I believe the name of the board, whether it's an advisory board, a board of directors, or something else, doesn't really matter. Ultimately, it's the owner's business. If the board makes a decision, its implementation is mandatory for management, provided the owner has approved it. If management does not implement a decision, it's important to investigate why. This may simply be due to insufficient competence, or perhaps management lacks the necessary resources. In other words, you need to understand why it's not working. When owners create a board, I wouldn't recommend forming shadow board with many members whose expertise duplicates that of management, because management may not have that level of expertise. The board should consist of people who are truly experienced specialists in their field. I believe it's important to develop and hire qualified personnel, rather than creating duplicated functions. When forming a board, it is important to bring in directors who can provide guidance on the owner's most critical priorities. As we've mentioned, this is primarily about strategic development. For example, in the case of a small or medium-sized business, it makes sense to include someone who has already grown a company, who has served as a CEO, and who has navigated different stages of business growth, whether in their own company or through prior professional experience. Such a person should be ready to share what has worked and what hasn't. Second, they bring hands-on experience in managing a company, leading a team, setting objectives, reshaping processes, and being accountable for financial results. In other words, they bring a level of knowledge and responsibility that is highly valuable to a company which has not yet gone through these stages. Another qualification that companies often look for in board members is expertise in finance. Specifically, they seek individuals who can advise on setting up internal control systems, establishing reporting processes, and managing communication with auditors, banks, and investors. It is quite common for a board to include such a specialist. Beyond that, the composition should be guided by the company's most pressing challenges. For Ukrainian companies today, this could mean expanding into export markets, and that's not easy. That is why bringing in someone who has successfully done this multiple times can be extremely valuable for the business. In other words, the board should be formed based on the company's specific priorities, not simply by duplicating existing functions. I also believe that owners should be part of the board, not positioned above it. This way, the decisions made by the board are aligned with the owner's priorities as they should be. But once those decisions are made, they need to be implemented, and that is when the structure truly works. Here I'm referring specifically to boards for SMBs. Of course, once an investor comes in, especially if they acquire a minority stake, the decision-making dynamics will inevitably change. This is because the investor will also have certain rights, which are typically negotiated during the deal process. In most cases, these take the form of blocking rights, designed to protect the investor's financial interests.
In fact, this often becomes the fastest and potentially the most effective way to implement governance practices, since the investor is directly motivated to ensure they are in place.
It's worth noting that back in the 1990s, when the first private equity funds were established in Ukraine, these were primarily funds with foreign capital. These were foreign investors. When these funds first began investing, they were among the very first to introduce corporate governance principles into their portfolio companies. The same was true for international financial institutions that entered the market and made investments. They understood the importance of governance and clearly saw the results. So yes, in general, an investor can serve as a tool for improving corporate governance, but not every company actually needs an investor. Many companies continue to grow through their own capital or with the support of bank loans. In such cases, an investor may not be necessary, but the implementation of corporate governance principles still is. Step by step, these companies need to adopt such practices and strengthen their decision-making discipline. This will ultimately enable them to reach a new level of development.
Investors, and private equity investors in particular, are not only a source of financing but also a source of expertise and a broader perspective for companies, especially in the SMB segment. This comes from the wealth of experience that such investors typically bring to the table.
Absolutely, I agree.
That is why, before approaching these types of investors, business owners might consider investing some time in education. For example, they could take part in training programs offered by UCGA, the Ukrainian Corporate Governance Academy, or CGPA, the Corporate Governance Professional Association. Such programs provide essential knowledge on how to properly build corporate governance, how it works, and how it can benefit a business.
I completely agree. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Corporate governance practices are already well described. Both UCGA and CGPA have been offering training programs for quite some time, and both organizations have a very strong methodological base. This knowledge can only be of help.
Oksana, thank you very much for such an interesting conversation and for the valuable advice.
Sergey, thank you for the invitation. It was a real pleasure, and I would be happy to continue our discussions if the opportunity arises. So until next time.
Thank you again, Oksana. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. See you in our upcoming episodes.